you want to start recording?
Yeah, I started recording. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to component-driven theming with Storybook. One item of note, we are going to have a post-session Q&A in case we don't have enough time during this session. And if folks want to ask the three of us any deeper dive questions or chat about our session today, or it sounds like even chickens are something that we have a little bit of expertise in. Well, I'm Aaron Couch. I'm a longtime Drupaler and Director of Technology at Prominent Source. I think I've lost count at maybe 5 or 6, but this is probably my 5th or 6th Drupal GovCon, and it's definitely one of my favorites. And I don't miss the lines, but I will look forward to seeing people in person next year.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Evan Wilhite. I'm an Emulsify project lead based out of Nashville, Tennessee, senior front-end engineer at Four Kitchens, and what is that called, a Bitmoji? See, that really is my spirit animal. Brian asked me to make a Bitmoji for like over a year probably, and so finally I did, and I made it look like that. That's me. Take it away, Brian.
All right, I'm Brian Lewis. I'm the other Emulsify project lead. I live in Wichita, Kansas. I'm also a front-end engineer at Four Kitchens. And this is a real picture of me and not a Bitmoji.
Great. And again, we're using the Emulsify theme and design system. And here's a link to that. And let's get started. So components are standardized building blocks for user interfaces. You can think of them as Lego building bricks. The smaller pieces are assembled and put together into larger items that are reusable across different contexts. Each piece is self-contained, and the goal is to be reusable, like the tree in this example. We should be able to use that tree in a different context and not build from scratch every time. Some of the problems that components and component-driven development try and solve can be especially evident with the quote-unquote traditional Drupal theming, including CSS and JavaScript selectors that are tied to their context, i.e. where they're put on the page, or tied to their back-end implementation, i.e. whether they're implemented with views or paragraphs or other Drupal rendering tools. Without a component methodology, we can tend to theme for the page, and the result is often assets that can't be reused across projects. Some of the solutions include adopting a consistent methodology for naming and organizing the code base and assets. Emulsify uses atomic design, but there are a lot of other methodologies out there. It's also helpful to have tools to organize and build out your component library. We're using Storybook. Let's look at a real-world example. This is a typical carousel component. I think there are a lot of us waiting for these to go away, but for now they aren't. They're a part of almost every web property. This is how many of us have tackled creating front-end assets for things like a carousel. As you can see, this is a project that I worked on, and I can claim some responsibility for this. As you can see, the assets are tied to the Drupal implementation and combined with other elements. I'd point out that they are not only tied to paragraphs in this case, but the specific name of the paragraph. Reusing this is difficult if there are any changes to the data model. Suppose if we wanted to use blocks, or if we wanted to change the name of the paragraph. And you'll note that in this case, we used one big JavaScript file for the entire project. With components, all the assets, including JavaScript, CSS, and templates, are grouped together. The selectors only reference the elements in the templates, so they are isolated and a coherent whole. In the Drupal template, we use Twig's ability to embed or include templates to render the component in Drupal. If the backend implementation changes or we want to move to another project, the component itself is not changed. What we're looking at is an example of embedding the previous component. In this case, changing the block type or backend implementation means that we can still embed the same component. The concept of components and component-based development have been around for quite a while now. React was first released in 2013, and along with other libraries like Vue, are component-driven tools that represent a growing part of a larger front-end ecosystem. John Album, as you can see, created the component module in 2016, and that module is the basis for the namespacing that a lot of the component-driven themes take advantage of. So I, as you noted, I'm not part of Four Kitchens, but stumbled upon Emulsify earlier this spring. I was really and am excited about it because of the component library setups. Really well done and useful. The atomic design methodology is well useful, and the Storybook integration is fantastic as well. So these are some of the reasons that we've adopted Emulsify at Promit, and I've been excited to connect with the Emulsify team. So I'm going to hand it over to Evan, so we can take a deeper dive. Or Brian, that's right.
Yep. I actually did just post a link in the chat to the slides if anybody wants to follow along in case you have joined since we started. But let's go ahead and talk about how to use the new Emulsify on a Drupal project. So you can install Emulsify Drupal independently as a prototyping tool and/or inside Drupal as a theme. Now, this is an overview of the Drupal installation instructions. You can see the full instructions for more detail. But as you can see above, you're essentially going to require Emulsify Drupal within your project, create your own custom theme for it using the built-in script, install our dependencies, and then build and enable it in your project. And now the fun part. Let's start building components. Now, if you're new to atomic design, the first thing to know is that it's just a means of organization. It's not required in Emulsify Drupal, but it is used by default. And for anybody who is skeptical, I used to be one of those, I'll make a quick case for it. So atomic design gives a simple, abstract, and common language for organizing components from smallest to largest. As any project scales, you'll need a system that allows your team to find and reuse components easily. I was initially opposed to the abstract language of atoms, molecules, etc., but eventually I found that the alternatives were more problematic because they cause confusion by not being abstract enough. Words like blocks and modules, for instance, because they mean too many things within coding languages and within systems like Drupal and outside of the Drupal world, there's confusion between all the parties that need to talk about them. So what you see above is Emulsify's organizational pattern by default. So you'll notice the base directory, and this is where we store global things such as Sass variables and mixins, colors, and typography. One of the most common questions we get is when to use templates and pages. So I want to talk about those real quick, and then we'll jump back to the atoms, molecules, and organisms. Templates are a way to define the highest level, usually page level, reusable layouts. These are essentially wireframes of your page types, but these layout templates do get used by your pages in Drupal. So for example, the page.html.twig file would map to one of these. Pages should also be easy to produce. We're prototyping after all. And in their final form, these should be as close to, if not exact matches to final pages that would be built in Drupal. The pages are not ever included by any Drupal template. These are strictly for prototyping. And I found them to be invaluable for showing me how my components interact with each other, since this is often the first time I've placed two molecules or organisms next to each other. I can't tell you how many times I've found out that I forgot to add outer margins to an organism, but saw the omission as soon as I placed it on the page. And the best part is that all of this is done without a database, so I can see the issues and fix them nearly instantly in Storybook before I spin up my Drupal site. But now let's jump into what you will see when you first open your Emulsify theme. So first of all, Emulsify ships with add-ons that are ready-made for prototyping. These are the most common basic elements of a website. They're minimally styled and ready to be tweaked for your project's needs. Emulsify also ships with some example molecules, organisms, templates, and pages that can help beginners see how components come together. All components in Emulsify can and should be tweaked to work for your project and or even removed if you don't use them. The key is that the organizational structure and basic elements are in place for you to immediately hit the ground running, building your project's components, rather than messing with repeating the same foundational steps from project to project. Now let's talk about BEM for just a minute. Component-driven development is all about reuse and isolation. BEM, which stands for Block Element Modifier, is a class naming convention that helps accomplish this isolation elegantly within CSS. We won't go into a lot of detail about this here, but we have linked to the BEM website above for anyone who needs more information. But let's take a look at it briefly in regards to using Emulsify. So in BEM, you have blocks like the article class here, and inside that you have elements such as a heading and text, and their class names combine the block with the element name using double underscores between them. So we have article double underscore heading and article double underscore text. And finally, you can have modifiers on any class. So as you see here with our article -- featured modifier, these BEM naming conventions allow you to create a consistent class naming experience. And again, the goal here is isolation. So we would try not to use the article class on any other component, or not use it as a class name because it's tied to this component. And in theory, you would want to be able to change and or remove components completely without negatively affecting anything else across your entire application. Now, because we're reusing Twig components in multiple places, we need a way to pass block, element, and or modifier names into these when we use them. And this is why we created the BEM Twig function, which you'll see used in Emulsify. In this Twig function, the first argument creates a block. So you can see this in the first example above. If used in combination with the second argument, you can pass modifiers. And this is an array because you can have multiple modifiers. You can see in our second example above, we have title and title -- small. And then finally, the third argument adds a block and makes the first into an element. So in our third example, because we pass card as the third argument, we get card double underscore title as our class. And this isn't in the slides here, but there's actually a fourth argument that is a second array that you can use to pass in any arbitrary class to a component, which is really useful in cases, but not the most used part of the BEM function. Now this is just a brief overview. You can see the Emulsify Twig module README for details, but let's see this in action to understand the how and why a little better. You can see the before example above contains typical HTML manually writing out the BEM classes, and the after contains the same markup using our BEM function. So now that we have converted it, why should we do it this way? Well, there's a couple reasons. First, because we're reusing these components in numerous situations. It's extremely common for component-driven development to need to pass in different block, element, or modifier names per component usage. And this is the first way the BEM function comes to the rescue. Secondly, Drupal attaches its own attributes for things like quick edit links, and our BEM function coordinates with those so that they don't get overridden or replaced. So even though this is a new convention to learn, it really becomes second nature and makes using BEM in component-driven Twig easy and powerful. Well, finally, I'll mention briefly, we also have another function called add attributes, and that's for adding any attributes, not just class names. These two together can cover any attribute situation needed in a component. And again, see the README linked in the other slide for examples. Now let's talk about our prototyping environment. The new Emulsify uses Storybook for a prototyping environment. Storybook is an amazing prototyping tool with a truly impressive amount of support behind it. At its core, Storybook is a static site generator and development environment that allows you to quickly see and share components automatically as you build them. But it's also pluggable. It has a system of add-ons that provide all kinds of helpful functionality, including accessibility testing, which we use by default in Emulsify. It can also support a number of languages besides Twig, which makes it extremely versatile across large organizations with a variety of code bases. Here's an example of one of 4Kitchen's largest client component libraries in the new Emulsify, which is ithaca.edu. There's a link at the top of this slide if you want to check it out. It's actually live and you can view it for yourself. This was one of our first projects to upgrade to the new Emulsify, and it's an awesome example of the power of Storybook for prototyping large-scale projects sharing a number of different components. And now I'm going to pass it off to Evan to do a little demo.
All right, everybody should be seeing the demo slide there.
I can
Is
see
that
it.
right? Okay, great. All right, hey everyone, thank you, Brian and Aaron. So now that we have our bearings on what we're working with, let's move into a demo of how you might build a component in the new Emulsify Drupal project. So for this demo, we will build a simple common component for a project, which is the teaser. We will follow component-driven development best practices and build it as a reusable, isolated component, and then show how to use it in one place in Drupal as an example. So let's imagine this is our design mockup. This could be a list of blog articles or news items. At bottom though, it's a list of teasers. So let's break down this mock into atomic elements to better understand it. So at the most basic level, each of the teasers has two atoms, a heading and a text. In Emulsify, these basic elements are provided by default, so we can immediately move to the level of the component that we need, which is the teaser itself. We need to build a teaser molecule that uses these two heading and text atoms. It should be styled like this when we are done. And then finally, we will need to build a teaser list organism that combines these and that will match our mockup. So let's start with the teaser. Here we are in our molecules directory. We're going to add a new teaser directory and then 4 files. Our Twig file for our markup and our Twig, a YAML file for our mock data, a SAS file for our styling, and then finally a stories file for adding the new component to Storybook. In the Twig file, we want to write our markup for our component. Here is some basic HTML5 markup for a teaser component. It has an article tag as a wrapper, a heading with a link inside of it with our heading and some paragraph text. Notice the use of our BEM function sprinkled throughout as well. But we can do better than this, right? After all, we're not reusing any atoms here, we're just rewriting them. So let's take a look at how we might reuse instead of recreate. So now you can see in this example, we're starting to include other component files. Our heading atom in Emulsify already contains the ability to have a link in it, so we only needed to create 2 include statements here and then populate our variables correctly. This is where you start to see the BEM function really shine, because notice we can write our component-based class once at the top as a variable and then assign it anywhere else, including passing it into included components. So this file creates the exact same markup as the previous file we just looked at. But the only HTML element we have written here is our new article tag, which is specific to our component. This reuse means we only have to debug our heading and paragraph in one place, which are the original atoms. So let's move on to our data. So in our data file, we're going to populate our Twig variables with some mock data for Storybook. These are the parts we will replace with real data later in Drupal. But for now, we can quickly prototype this in Storybook using this data. Emulsify supports data in both YAML and JSON formats. And of course, we have our styling. So our teasers only require minimal styling, as you can see. And although unfortunately we don't have time to go into much detail about the styling in Emulsify in this session, you can see above that we also use the same principles of reuse in our SaaS. So Emulsify ships with foundational variables, mixins, and functions for covering many things from color to typography to spacing. You can tweak these to the needs of your project and then hit the ground running, writing very consistent styling with powerful reuse across all of your components. And then finally, we have our stories file. So these files all follow the same convention. You're going to import your component and your data. You're going to tell Storybook where to put the new component. And then you export an example or multiple examples of your components using your mock data. So if you're new to this, don't worry. Creating these files and even copying and pasting them becomes quick and second nature when prototyping. So once we've saved our stories file, we will see our component automatically show up in Storybook. So when we make changes to our component twig, Sass, or data, Storybook will immediately reload and show those changes. As you can see, we now have an isolated and reusable teaser component that we have successfully added to our component library. Now let's jump over to the Drupal side for a moment. In a second, we will leverage our new teaser component, but first let's think through an example architecture we might use. So a good, easy example of leveraging teasers in Drupal would be the default article content type, and specifically the teaser display mode. This display mode is what is automatically shown in the default front page view in Drupal. So we will map our atoms, our heading and text, to article content type fields of title and body, which means that our molecule will naturally map directly to the article teaser node template. And then eventually we will create a teaser list component, which will map to our front page view of article teasers. So first, let's focus on the teaser molecule component we just created. So here we are looking at a basic Drupal 9 site with our custom Emulsify theme enabled. We have also populated a single piece of article content to work with. Assuming you have enabled Twig debugging, you will see template suggestions when inspecting the markup. Since we want to connect the article teaser to our component, we can use the node-article-teaser.html.twig file. And we can replace the default contents of that file with this simple include statement you see here. Notice we're just including our teaser component, and then just telling the component what data we want to pass to it. So in this example, the data is easy. URL and label are provided by default in the node template. And for the body field, Drupal makes it easy to pass in that data using the simple content.fieldName convention. So for us, that field has the machine name of body, so the data is passed using content.body. Let's take a minute to talk about getting data in Drupal, because you will quickly discover that sometimes getting the data across files and entities is not as straightforward as the example that we just looked at. Thankfully, we have a set of tools that helps us do this. There are a number of tools out there, but our team uses the Devel module and specifically the Kent plugin. These are not wrapped into Emulsify, so you can use your own tools if you are partial to something else. But those are the ones that I'll cover here. We also now need a helper module called Devel Kent Extras, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So adding these adds the ability to not only use the Kent function with any pre-processing or PHP files, but also directly in the Twig files themselves. Again, assuming you have Twig debugging enabled. So notice the first line of code at the top where we are kenting the content variable. That will create what we see above in every node on the screen. Notice that it shows us a nice accordion breakdown of our fields with a content variable within the content variable, where we can inspect the details of each. So this is your entry point to discovering how to retrieve your data in your Twig files. So a whole session could likely be devoted to using Kent and Devel and Drupal theming, but for time's sake, let's cover some quick tips and tricks. The first is that you can print the item itself by adding .0 to the end. So this will print the value of that field without any wrapping elements. And we'll actually look at an example of this here in a minute. Second, if the content variable is not available or doesn't work as you expected, try using the elements variable. In the region template, for example, you can use elements.blockID to retrieve a specific block assigned to that region. Also note that this is one of the rare cases where the comments in the Twig file do not actually tell you that. Finally, and most importantly, you want to discover the most concise and standardized ways to retrieve values. And in my experience, methods are your best friend. The Devel Kent Extras module adds these back in. They were recently removed in the default Devel and Kent implementation. So that Extras module will add these back, and these are priceless. These methods can be used directly in your Twig files to retrieve data in a very standardized, safe, and efficient way. So familiarize yourself with the contents of that Available Methods tab, and it will pay off in dividends. So now back to our Drupal site. So once we have added our new node-article-teaser template and cleared the cache to have Drupal register it, we can now see in our markup that Drupal is using our new template instead of the default node template. More importantly, we can see our teaser component is being used. Do you recognize the new styling? So when we look a little bit deeper at the markup though, we notice something wrong is going on. Instead of populating our body field into our component's paragraph tag, our paragraph tag is being pushed aside and a new div with the class of text long is being stuck between it. This is because this field from Drupal contains the entire contents of a WYSIWYG field. While this didn't appear to affect the front end visually, it very easily could have, because notice we have two p tags in there. You can't see in the first one, but neither of those have any content in them. So if you have margins on your paragraph tags, for instance, we would notice that. We don't want our WYSIWYG field to be wrapped in a paragraph tag because it could contain a variety of tags in and of itself, including its own paragraph tags. So let's take a look at how to tweak this content.body field and learn some Twig superpowers along the way. So back in our component file, instead of just a paragraph tag, let's actually wrap our text element in a new div, give that div the class of text, and put our old paragraph include inside a Twig block called teaser content. This Twig block is our first superpower in component-driven development. It enables us to create sections in our components that can contain default content, but whose content can be completely replaced by any files that include or embed them later. So you can see our component still provides default content inside the block, which is our original paragraph. This means our Storybook example will remain exactly as it was. But now let's look at how we can change our Drupal file to use this new superpower and clean up our markup. So this is the Drupal file currently, but let's replace this include with this embed statement. So there are two ways of using Twig blocks, the extends and the embed tags. Since we need to pass in variables and use Twig blocks, we have to use the embed tag, which allows for both. This is a very common tag to use and is our final superpower in Twig component-driven development. By switching to this tag, we can still pass URL and label as variables, but we can move printing content.body into our new teaser content block. And now let's inspect our markup again. So this is much better. We don't have awkward empty paragraph tags hanging out anywhere. We still have our teaser text element if we need to apply any styling to that. And our WYSIWYG section can pass all its goodness through with no incorrect wrapper. Let's make one more tweak, which we talked about earlier. Let's change it from content body to content body.0. So look at how nice and clean this is. This wasn't absolutely necessary in our circumstance, but I wanted to show you a quick way to clean up your markup in case you don't need that the outer wrapper that Drupal offers by default on that field. So now that we have our teaser component and an example of how to use it in Drupal, let's create our teaser list organism. So again, this is our mock, and it represents what we should have when we complete this part. Just like in our previous example, we are going to add a new directory, except now in our organisms folder, and populate it with the files that we need, which are shown here. Much of this should look familiar by now. We have our wrapper tag and our class variable. We have a heading, which we could reuse better, by the way. But the key to understanding this organism is the Twig block called teaser_list_teasers. It's a funny name. Notice here we have populated that block with some default content. which is a for loop that will loop through some mock data to show teasers. This helps us, again, quickly mock data for Storybook. So let's look at how to write that data. So here is our teaser list YAML file. And notice our usage of an array called teasers. That contains 3 items, each with its own content. And then, of course, we have a little minimal styling for our background color and padding, etc. And then finally, we have our stories file. This is nearly identical to the one that we looked at previously, except you see that we have imported our correct Twig file and YAML file and populated it into the place that we want in Storybook. So now that we saved those, we have our teaser list component in Storybook. Notice how quickly we're moving now. So oftentimes component-driven development requires more forethought than previous methodologies, but it is meant to also speed up projects along the way, because after all, we're reusing, not rewriting code. So if the client and designer also start to think in those reusable ways, you can not only deliver projects that provide consistent user interfaces, which is good for the user, but also projects where you get to reuse these components as the production team, as the designers and developers, instead of having to recreate them. So when this is done correctly, this nearly guarantees that projects greatly speed up throughout their life cycle and are also much more maintainable because you're only troubleshooting things in one location, for instance. So now let's jump over and add our new teaser list component in Drupal. So here we are inspecting the wrapper around our teasers, which, as we mentioned before, is the front page view. So instead of the default view template, we want one specific to this front page view. So we want views-view -- the ID of the view, which in this case is front page.html.twig. So replace the contents of that views view file with this new embed. This should all be familiar by now, except within our teaser block, we are now going to tell our component that in the contents of the teaser_list_teasers block, we want to pass the views rows. By the way, the original contents of these Twig files will tell you what variables to use, with some notable exceptions like I mentioned earlier. Most of the Drupal files come with all of the variables listed at the top, so it's easy to kind of see how you can get the data manipulated in your file. Once we have saved that new file and cleared the cache, we can now see our new file and our new teaser list component being used. And here we have added a second article and our list is looking great. This is component-driven development in Drupal using Emulsify. So one final note, you may want to mock this up in Storybook inside a full page as an example, either for a client or a future developers. By default in Emulsify, we provide some example pages, one of which is a home page. So let's add our new list to our default homepage to show how quickly you can prototype things in Storybook. So I'm not going to show the whole file here, but notice here the important content that I added. I'm simply including our teaser list. But how does this page use the teaser data? Well, here we are in the stories file for our homepage. Again, just showing the important parts. Notice we are importing our teaser list data from our teaser list component that we just created. That way, we don't even have to copy or paste or rewrite that data. Once we do that, we add that data to the component as seen below, and we have our articles section in our Storybook homepage using the same data that we used for our teaser list. And by the way, in this screenshot, I'm viewing this using the open in a new window functionality in Storybook, where you can view components in their own page without Storybook's UI Chrome. All right, we're ready to wrap this up, and I'm going to pass this back to Aaron.
Great, thanks. So I did not, thanks, Evan. I didn't know about the zero trick before we did this together. So thanks for including that. And yeah, it's amazing how much more there is out there, even when you think you're on top of it. Great. So before wrapping up, in our wrap up, we wanted to note some of the changes and challenges with components and Emulsify. one of the primary ones is there becomes kind of like a new workflow. The front-end devs can work completely in the component library and Storybook, and that's really valuable. You can bring in new folks who aren't familiar with Drupal and don't know Drupal, but that's something to keep aware of. And you can kind of decouple the Drupal implementation from the building of basically what everything's going to look like in the component library, and that can take some getting used to. You might experience what you might call a weird velocity. This was definitely the case for our first couple of projects where a lot of work goes up front into creating all of the components, and especially if you have folks that are focused on that first, your project managers might see a lot of time, and it seems like things are getting done, but they don't see it on the Drupal end. But then all of a sudden, once the component library is done, embedding those in Drupal is really quick, and so that's definitely different than kind of some traditional theming where you might start with the globals and work your way locally. So that's a good thing to keep in mind.
One note, I'm going to add a
Yeah.
note to that real quick, Aaron, because it definitely changes how velocity works. Sometimes, probably especially if you're new to this, it will seem slower at first. But on a recent project that we just did, it actually made our velocity faster at the beginning because I didn't have to wait on any backend development to be done before I could start working on the front end. And so while traditionally we'd have a sprint or two of just backend with no front end development being done at all because they're trying to create all the content types and paragraph types and whatever we're using on that project before a front end developer comes in. But with this methodology, they were able to start on that. I was able to start writing the components in parallel. And then once the backend was done, all I had to do was create that Drupal template that says, okay, now this paragraph type should look like that component, and this content type should look like that component. And we were able to very quickly get things done, and actually increased our initial velocity because of that decoupled nature.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it can take some convincing if you've been doing it the other way for a while to kind of really understand what that means. Applying the components to Drupal templates is a huge learning curve. It was especially for me. Evan gave some really good tricks and tips for getting the data out, and but you are kind of working with a undocumented API in some ways, and that can be tough. And understanding the nesting is often difficult. There are more and more examples of this in action, which I typically learn better by example sometimes, and that's something that we're trying to produce, and the community's producing. So that's definitely a huge help in that regard. And then Evan, did you want to talk about the not cheating?
Yeah. Sorry, I was responding to a question in our comments. So yeah, the very last thing of note here is a comment that we have learned to often throw out there, which is that it's easy to get into component-driven development and really kind of assume that everything needs to be reusable and complex enough to handle any situation from the beginning. Basically, once you learn that methodology, you want to apply it to everything. But in reality, on projects, the workflow that Brian and I use on projects at Four Kitchens and the other engineers at Four Kitchens use is really to only give the component the complexity that it needs for the situation. And in fact, there are even times when just the lack of time or on the project or whatever, we're not going to necessarily, like, it's okay to write an H2 tag when you need to write an H2 tag. It doesn't have to be this thing where you're reusing things everywhere. Obviously, the larger your application is, the more that makes sense. But basically, it's one of those lessons that this is meant to speed up your development. It's not meant to tie your hands and make you do a bunch of steps to create a component that you never did before. But it does have the flexibility when you, like I said, when you are building a complex project, to build those components in reusable ways where you're only debugging things once and all of that.
Great. So here's what you get out of the box in terms of the components. There's a base color palette and some motion examples. Here's some of the add-ons that ship with Emulsify. You'll notice that they're pretty lightly themed initially, as we noted, and that is a huge help. Some of the molecules that build up into the organisms and templates. There's 2 templates that ship a full width and sidebar 1, and those are built out into the full pages. And out of the box, we get an article and a landing page. For us, it's been useful to actually use the pages in Storybook and fully build them out. We've had a couple projects where we've done that or not done that, and it can seem like an extra step because you're assembling things strictly in a template that you're not really going to reuse, but it's really helpful to have as a living example in Storybook and to go through that step of constructing it. Evan, do you want to talk about the ecosystem?
So yeah, sure. So what we've covered in this session is really the Emulsify Drupal project, which is a specific project within a larger Emulsify Design System ecosystem. And the reason we made this is because one of our pain points in the original Emulsify was that it was really just a component library that spoke to the production team. And we found on large scale projects, which are the most important projects for a design system not to fall apart on, for them to actually get used long term, we found that we were missing some pieces for that. So one of the first things we created was a separate style guide project, and this is installed and used outside of what we just covered. But it uses Gatsby, and it's a way to create basically authoritative documentation around your project for all teams. So not just the production team, but also anyone from C-levels to marketing to content would be using this when ramping up on your digital, on the digital efforts for that organization. So that exists. It can tie in with your component library. It ties in with Storybook. So you can actually show Storybook components within it that are the live Storybook examples. You're not going to have to rewrite those and be in that kind of situation. And then the other 3 things that we listed here are projects besides the Drupal project that we created that are kind of like starters, because in this new system where we're using Storybook and Webpack, we have the ability to basically build large scale projects where multiple sub-projects are using different languages, such as React or WordPress or Gatsby. And we can share code across those. So you could have, for instance, your Twig files become a package that gets used in a WordPress and a Drupal project. Your React files get used in a React project. All of them share SAS files, maybe. That's just one example. Carbon Design System by IBM is a good example of this. But we have this ability in the new WordPress, or in the new Emulsify, which is why I wanted to stress that ecosystem in case you go to this location and see all of these repos. If you are interested in learning more about that, like we mentioned earlier, we are going to have kind of a post-session Q&A, but also there is an example project in that Emulsify-DS organization where we made a fake university project. We work a lot in higher ed at 4 Kitchens, and so we created a project to demonstrate this, where there's the organization, multiple sub-schools using different languages, and they all can share code, and those projects are fully built. They're minor examples, but they're fully built, so you can actually see how those pieces fit together if you're interested in that.
Great. Here's some good resources. The Drupal Twig Slack channel is great for any front-end Drupal work. You'll find the folks here in the Storybook JS and components channels. This list of Drupal component resources has a ton of links to other component themes, videos, blog posts, documentation, etc. And the Emulsify docs are the place to get started and extend Emulsify. As we mentioned, there'll be a post-session Q&A. We'll see. We wanted to offer this just so that we could more mimic the in-person exchanges that you typically have. So come join if you're interested. So I think we're close to time. We might have some time for a couple questions. Is there a moderator? Well, I think we do have a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions, I've been talking. Brian or Evan, are there any items from the channel that you want to highlight or answer in for everyone?
I can address the pattern lab one, and that sounds like Brian's responding to a UI patterns question. On the pattern lab side, so when we first started down this road, we were researching because the old Emulsify was on pattern lab PHP, which was basically being sunsetted in favor of pattern lab Node. And what that meant for us were, that was a positive thing because we were already interested in moving away from like a PHP-based ecosystem for our prototyping tools. So there was already this kind of strong Node element to Emulsify to begin with. There was a gulp build system, all of these things are JavaScript. And it made us kind of take a step back and just evaluate the marketplace for component libraries. And in our research, what we found, and maybe I was too quick to use the word declining, if I used the word declining, I guess I did, yeah. Pattern Lab it doesn't remotely compare with Storybook. Storybook has kind of become the de facto component library across multiple languages. And so for us, specifically at Four Kitchens, where we have a strong JavaScript team, we have projects that we work on that are not Drupal at all. It really made sense to use the best tool that has become popular and well-maintained and committed to across multiple languages. So I did have some worries about the long-term kind of support around Pattern Lab because it seemed like from when we first started using it to when we started doing research that the maintainership had declined. So that's kind of what I meant by that, but hopefully that helps. It really kind of came down to the decision of Storybook being an excellent component library. It had all the features of Pattern Lab plus many, many more. The plugin system is huge. Brad Frost, the creator of Pattern Lab, has moved away from it to Storybook, if that gives you any idea. So we didn't not want to support that community, but we had to make a decision around the best tool for that, and Storybook just stands out right now.
Great, we're close to time, I think. Are there any other questions that we can address now quickly, or someone just popped in something else, another one? Oh, okay. Well, we'll be on the Zoom at 4:30 Eastern, and want to thank everyone for attending, and definitely hit us up there or in Drupal, the Slack channel, Drupal Twig Slack, and on the issue queues. So thanks.